For this video, I'm going to focus on gas exchange between the pulmonary blood and the alveolar spaces. Gas exchange occurs via the diffusion of gases down their partial pressure gradients. The rate of gas diffusion between the alveolar spaces and the pulmonary blood obeys this relationship. That is, the rate of gas flow, the flow rate of the diffusible gases, is equal to the diffusing capacity and the partial pressure gradient between the alveolar spaces and the pulmonary capillaries. This relationship is analogous to Ohm's law for electrical current, where the current is equal to the product of the conductance and the voltage difference across the circuit. The fact that the flow rate of the diffusible gases is proportional to the partial pressure gradient should make sense to you, because the partial pressure gradient essentially determines the concentration gradient between these two compartments. The larger the concentration gradient, the greater the rate of gas diffusion between the two compartments. The effects of the diffusing capacity, however, are a little bit more complex because there's a number of parameters which determine the diffusing capacity. Some of them are determined by the chemical structure of the gas molecules, and other aspects are determined by the nature of the gas exchange interface. So the main parameters that determine the diffusing capacity are: the diffusing capacity is proportional to the surface area, A, and the solubility of the gas, and inversely proportional to the barrier thickness, that is the thickness of the diffusion barrier, and the square root of the molecular weight of the gas. The diffusing capacity is also determined by the proportionality constant K, which is the nature at which the gas interacts with the physical features of the diffusion barrier. This is not something we're going to spend time thinking about in this video. So we'll come back to these parameters in a bit. Something I want to emphasize, though, is the importance of the rate at which gas is able to diffuse across this diffusion interface. The rate at which the gas is diffusing is important because gas exchange involves the loading and unloading of pulmonary blood that is not stationary. That is, the blood is in transit, moving along the exchange interface. This means that each fraction of blood that enters the interface has a finite amount of time for gas exchange to occur. Therefore, if the rate of exchange occurs slowly, gas exchange might not occur to completion before that fraction of blood leaves the interface and is sent back into systemic circulation. Basically, it can leave without a full load of oxygen or without emptying the excess carbon dioxide it's carrying before returning to the systemic circulation. Because of this feature, a useful way to represent gas exchange is to look at it as the relationship between the capillary partial pressures of the blood gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, based on the distance at which the blood has traveled along the diffusion interface. So first, let's look at oxygen. Note that the pulmonary capillaries are supplied by pulmonary arterial blood, which is relatively low of oxygen. Typical partial pressure of oxygen at rest in this pulmonary arterial blood is approximately 40 millimeters of mercury. Note that the alveolar PO2 is typically somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 millimeters of mercury. So we have a partial pressure gradient between the alveolar air and the pulmonary capillaries. This gradient is going to favor the movement of oxygen from the alveolar spaces into the pulmonary blood. And again, because the blood is traveling along the length of this diffusion interface, and because it takes time for gas diffusion to occur, the amount of time depends upon the rate at which the molecules are moving, the loading of oxygen occurs along the length of this diffusion interface, represented here as the percent distance along the capillary. If we assume a normal cardiac output and a normal diffusion capacity, the loading of oxygen reaches completion within the first quarter to 1/3 of that diffusion interface. Completion meaning that equilibration occurs between the alveolar air and the pulmonary blood. If you're a glass is half empty sort of person, you might look at this and say, well, gosh, what a waste of diffusion interface, because equilibration has occurred relatively shortly along the diffusion interface, And the rest of this diffusion interface is basically wasted space where there is no more net movement of gases across the diffusion interface. However, if you're a glasses half full type of person, you might see this as some margin of safety for instances where rates of gas diffusion are altered or the rates of blood flow are increased. And in fact, that's kind of how it works. This next line here represents two types of situations. Notice that for the second line, equilibration still occurs, but it requires nearly the entire length of that diffusion interface. So what does this curve represent? It can represent two types of changes to our system here. The first one is this can represent a reduction in our diffusing capacity. What can lead to reductions in our diffusing capacity in this case? The two main changes that typically occur pathologically are, one, a decrease in the surface area of the diffusion interface. So if there is a smaller surface area, the rate at which gases can move is reduced. This is something that can occur with a variety of pulmonary conditions. Emphysema is one that results in a reduction in the surface area of the diffusion interface, thereby reducing that rate of gas diffusion. Another common pathological change to the diffusing capacity can result from an increase in the barrier thickness. The diffusion barrier between the alveolar space and the pulmonary capillaries is comprised of numerous cell walls, the interstitial fluid, and fluid layers which line the inside of the lung. Conditions which lead to a retention of fluid within the lungs, things like pulmonary edema and pleural effusion, can lead to an increase in the barrier thickness, thereby hindering the rate of oxygen diffusion from the alveolar spaces to the capillary. So that's also represented here by this curve. The other way that we can arrive at this relationship, besides a change in the diffusing capacity, is by an increase in the cardiac output, typically occurring via exercise. Why is it that changing the cardiac output alters this relationship between capillary distance and oxygen loading? Because as cardiac output increases, the blood moves through this diffusion interface faster, meaning that each fraction of blood that enters this interface spends less time in the diffusion interspace. So in this case, this isn't a change in the rate at which oxygen is able to load, the rate at which oxygen flows from the alveolar space into the capillary. This is a situation where the amount of time that the blood spends in the capillary, any given fraction of that blood that is reduced. So more of the diffusion interface is required for oxygen loading to occur. If the second line represents either an increase in the rate of cardiac output or a decrease in the diffusion capacity, this third line represents a combination of both. This is a situation where you have some decrease in the diffusing capacity due to one or more pulmonary conditions affecting the rate of gas diffusion, but then on top of that, if you increase the rate of cardiac output, then you might reach a situation where full equilibration does not occur. And this blood that leaves this diffusion interface, which is relatively deficient in oxygen, will be carried on out to the systemic circulation with a reduced oxygen content. Although the relationship for carbon dioxide is inverse to that of oxygen, meaning that carbon dioxide is being unloaded from the pulmonary blood, therefore the partial pressure is dropping along the length of the capillary, it has similar features to what we just described for oxygen. So the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the pulmonary blood entering the diffusion interface is relatively high. It's 46 millimeters of mercury compared to the alveolar PCO2 of 40 millimeters of mercury. This favors the unloading of carbon dioxide. Again, looking at it as a relationship between the distance along this interface and the pulmonary PCO2, full equilibration typically occurs within the first quarter to third of this interface. Similar to oxygen, this relationship can be extended further along the length of the capillary by either a decrease in the diffusing capacity or an increase in the cardiac output of blood. And finally, in cases where you have a severe reduction in the diffusing capacity and there's an increase in the cardiac output, this can produce situations where complete unloading of carbon dioxide does not occur. So note that oxygen loading and CO2 unloading typically requires about the same amount of interface to reach completion or to reach equilibration between the alveolar spaces in the pulmonary blood. How we arrive at this is interesting because a number of the parameters that determine the rate of oxygen diffusion and carbon dioxide diffusion are different, but they somehow seem to balance out in the end to produce similar rates of gas diffusion. For instance, oxygen has a larger partial pressure gradient than carbon dioxide, 100 to 40 compared to 46 to 40. This would favor an accelerated rate of oxygen diffusion. Furthermore, carbon dioxide has a larger molecular weight than oxygen. This too would seem to favor a quicker rate of oxygen diffusion. However, those advantages that oxygen has are offset by the difference in gas solubility. Carbon dioxide has a much higher solubility than oxygen. So in the end, the differences in those parameters all balance out, and oxygen and carbon dioxide both produce approximately the same rate of gas diffusion.